So you might just need to accept that. But yes, hello, welcome along to the Mentors Pack Lunch. Now, in this session, we've got, well, one thing I should say before we get started, a couple of announcements. Firstly, that this is our last live session before we get into the summer holidays. I was toying around with the idea of running one next week, but to be honest, if you are in school, then you're probably on a crazy off timetable week anyway. So the feedback was just that it wasn't necessarily worth running. And if you're not in school, then the last thing you want to be doing is talking about it with me. So this will be our last live session before the summer. I'm going to put some videos out over the summer that will be, keep things rolling, so you've always got access to those. And at the end of this session, normally I don't do any talking really about the programs that I run, but what I am doing at the moment is I do have some case study spaces available that I'm offering just to schools that are joining the Mentors Pack Lunch, and they're offered at a really, really good rate to be run in October, in November. So I'm going to share a little bit about that at the end, if that's all right with everyone. Now, what I want to do today is get the conversation going around EDI. Now, what I will start off by saying is that I am not an EDI expert. And I would never claim to be. That is not my area of expertise. But what I do know very, very well is how to navigate a difficult and awkward conversation. And what I know really well is about helping people handle opposing beliefs and views. And I know an awful lot about listening. And what I've observed through my experience in school, but also when I'm kind of in and out of different schools consulting, is how tricky and just anxiety inducing EDI can be. And that is not just for pupils worrying about getting things right or wrong, it's for staff as well. And so in this session, what we are going to talk about is really, well, what is the EDI elephant in the room? What is it that I think is perhaps going unsaid? I want to share with you a tool that I use, and really literally in the couple of days that I've been preparing for this session, I've come up with an acronym. I love an acronym, so I've come up with this acronym that just summarizes the steps that I encourage the people that I work with to use when they are approaching a more sensitive topic, a difficult conversation, and then what we can do to actually start shifting mindsets in real life. So I want to start with a bit of a story. And I recently was speaking to a teacher, and he's one of those teachers that pupils just love. He's one of those teachers that they just warm to, and they love what he's got to say. But he found himself standing in front of a classroom, being absolutely berated by his pupils. They're getting really annoyed and upset with him because he'd mistaken hijab for a niqab, and he'd got his words muddled up, and he'd got sort of some definition terminology wrong. And luckily for him, he was a sort of teacher that has that kind of self-belief and confidence, and he was able to really own the mistake that he'd made and move forward with it. But it really does speak to what happens, and that common issue that happens when we get onto a topic that is difficult to talk about. And so for me, the elephant in the room is that when you feel too scared to get it wrong, you cannot, for love nor money, get it right. And if we are too scared to come to these conversations and figure out how to start talking, we won't ever get it right, because we're not in the game. We're not in there trying to do it. And it's an issue that I actually see repeated time and time again every time I run a mentoring program. So when I look at the training that I run for my mentors, I always bring in scenario work, and they will role play being a mentor and a mentee. And the scenarios will cover things like the topics that are coming up in that school. So maybe some safeguarding issues, maybe some issues that that school has had with under the kind of EDI umbrella. It'll cover all kinds of different things. And without fail, the pupil that is playing the mentor will get stuck at some point. And when they get stuck, they say, Miss, I just like, they'll wave at me and they'll call me and I've got no idea what to say next. They've said this thing and I've got no idea what to say next. And my question back to them is always, well, what would you be asking if you weren't worried that your question was wrong? And without fail, the response that I get from them is that they'd be asking a question that felt too personal, that felt uncomfortable, and that felt triggering. And when I compare that to EDI, well, EDI is inherently personal, often uncomfortable, and nearly always triggering as well. And so that's why I wanted to bring this topic and this tool that we can start to use, because it's about, this is the tool that I use when it comes to asking the awkward question. And the awkward question is that thing that hangs in the room like a big old elephant and nobody wants to address it. And this is how you approach asking the awkward question. You approach it with vulnerability. So vulnerability is a willingness to be wrong. And ultimately, it's a willingness to actually be rejected. And humans are utterly terrified of rejection. It goes back to our kind of deep survival instincts that we never want to be sort of rejected from our clans or, you know, our group of people, because then, you know, we become really vulnerable and unsafe. You have to then own what you take ownership of your part. So it might be, when we're talking more broadly, it might be that you've done something wrong and it's taking ownership of that, ownership of the action and the part that you've had to play. I certainly know that for as a white British woman, I know that I have some awareness of the ownership that white British people have had, the impact that they have had around the world. But I'm not really talking about that level of ownership right now. I'm talking about your personal ownership. And that goes to absolutely everyone. Doesn't matter what background you are coming from, what area of the world you are coming from. Everyone can take ownership of their experience, and there has to be a willingness there to say, you know, I might have got it wrong, and I might still get it wrong. The next one is initiate, and this is about just asking the bleeding question. So when we think about awkward questions, we do all this stuff to try and avoid asking them, and we never actually just get to the point and ask the question. So it's about just diving in, being brave and asking the question. And when you ask that question, doing it with absolute curiosity, trying to understand where someone is coming from, putting yourself in their shoes, really approaching it with empathy. And lastly, it's embracing those differences. So we want to just be accepting that my life experience is true. And I've got 37 years to back up that my life experience is true, but someone else's experience will be totally different and is equally as true and valid. And being able to see the value in that differentiation and how much value that can serve going forward. If we're coming to the same problem, we've got really different perspectives. And if we can work together and combine that, that's an incredible thing. So to bring this to life a little bit, I wanted to tell you about a conversation I had with a lady I know. She's called Sophia, and she's come to be a friend, certainly a sort of a work friend that I truly respect, and she's fantastic. Her heritage is Pakistani, and she's Muslim, and she wears a hijab. And I mention this because it's relevant in the story that she was telling me. So Sophia had been to Tesco to pick up her click and collect order. And she went in with a trolley. She picked up her click and collect order, some clothes and some bits for the kitchen and the house. And then she had a couple of grocery bits that she needed to go and buy. So she went round, got the grocery bits, went through the self-checkout, scanned them through, and off she went out the shop. She was halfway across the car park, and the chap who'd been working on the self-checkout and two security guards came over to her and grabbed the trolley and said, "You haven't paid for this." And she said, "No, no, some of it was click and collect, but here's my receipt." And they said, "No, you've not paid for it." And she said, "Well, no, let me just show you on my phone." They said, "No, you've got to come back in the shop." Um, and as she was describing this scenario to me, I I like to think, it's a thing that I enjoy thinking about myself, is that I'm quite open-minded, that um am very willing to hear someone else's experience and believe it to be true. But my brain was automatically saying, well, I've experienced sort of similar things and they've just been real jobs worth. Maybe this wasn't about race. That was a question that was going through my mind. And I had a choice at that moment. And here are my three choices. My choices were, I could just say my not very thought through thought and probably result in some conflict with her, because her lived experience was very different to the assumptions that I was making. So I could create that conflict. I could say nothing. I could just say, "Oh, that sounds awful," and "Oh, isn't that a shame?" and not actually learn anything. So I would leave the conversation having not learned anything, not done any damage necessarily in my mind, but she certainly wouldn't have felt like I was validating her experience and recognizing what she had been through. Or I could use this approach. So what I did instead is I said, "Look, I I put myself out there. I went into the conversation. I chose to start the conversation about this and to dig into it a little bit more. And I said, "Look, I'm going to hold my hands up. I'm white. I'm Scottish. I cannot picture what that felt like for you, um, but I can feel myself making these assumptions. Then, and I just wonder, like, can I can I ask about it? Because in my head, I'm thinking he was probably a job's worth, and it might, maybe it wasn't about race, but clearly for you it was, and I really want to understand that. And so I was willing to be vulnerable. I took ownership of where my limitations were, and I said, look, I'm probably going to ask some really fumbled questions here, but then I went for it, and I just asked a bleeding question. I just said what that elephant in the room that I felt was there, which was, maybe he was a job's worth. And I was wrong, and I was willing to be, I was willing to be wrong. And what I was able to do then was just learn so much more and learn all this background that she had. But I was also able to help her think about the background that those other individuals had, and why were they coming to it that way. And we were able to then explore this whole situation from a really curious perspective. And finally, we were able to embrace the differences that she and I had, but certainly that she and the men that were involved had. And we were able to start brainstorming how she would maybe want to approach the next situation, or she would maybe want to manage herself the next time around, because she'd felt like she'd been really, really angry and then hadn't managed herself the way that she'd wanted to. But it was an amazing thing to go from where my comfort zone would have been, which would have been to say, "Oh, that was awful," and then not really ask any questions and certainly not learn anything, to using my voice and to asking the awkward question and figuring out how to do this. So simply by having that little bit of vulnerability, ownership, taking that initiative, well, that initiating that conversation, being curious and embracing the differences, we had a really valuable conversation. She felt that she had an ally, and I felt that I had an ally in this as well. And what I see a lot of times in school is that you will have fantastic teachers, and you may agree, disagree with me, or agree with me, and I'd love to know your opinions on this as well. Please feel free to disagree with me. But I go into schools and I think these are places that are filled with people who are really supportive of EDI, but maybe don't know how to feel confident having the conversation. They don't feel confident asking what they feel is an awkward question. And this is so true of the staff that I speak to. who feel really underqualified to actually have these discussions. The last thing, I always like sharing sort of another external resource for you, because it's certainly, particularly on a topic like EDI, I am certainly not the be all and end all. But this documentary by Dia Khan was incredible. If you've seen it, then I'm sure you will probably agree with me. But Dia Khan went across to the US and met with a load of neo-Nazi groups, and she wanted to understand them. And if you watch this, it's about 55 minutes, an hour long. If you watch this documentary, I'd love for you to think about it through this lens of voice. She made herself vulnerable. She went and put herself, she's marching through these rallies and through these protests with a group of neo-Nazis, and she's having things thrown at her. She's being pepper sprayed. It was, really powerful to watch this poor woman going through this with a group of people that inherently she felt she should hate. She owned her experiences. So she shared with them the experiences that she'd had, but she kept them as her experiences and wasn't sitting there blaming the men in front of her for them. She was asking difficult and awkward questions that prompted people to think and to talk, but she did it in such an incredibly respectful way. And she had so much curiosity for these people. I think it is so easy for us to sit in our ivory towers and cast aspersions and not actually just get in the mud and have these conversations with the people that we disagree with. It's more and more prevalent. The more online we are, the easier it is to sort of feel quite protected and just say what we want to say, but then not make it a real interaction. But what was really powerful is that at no point was she really focusing in on what was right and what was wrong. She set out her boundaries as to what she felt was right and wrong. But she wasn't there in a judgmental way. She was so respectful of their lived experience and so respectful of what had brought them to the point that they were at then. And the results was that by the end of this documentary, she was getting phone calls from them saying, I'm leaving the party. I'm not going to be part of that movement anymore. You've changed how I think about things. And when we think about the impact that we want to have in the world, that is what it's all about, is we want to think about the impact, not just saying our piece. So really what I would love for you to take away from this is that it doesn't really matter what the topic is necessarily. It could be, I mean, the one that I hear a lot about in school is toxic masculinity. It's the Andrew Tate conversation. But it could be racism, it could be homophobia, it could be sexism. But we only ever have those three choices. We can approach it with conflict, we can approach it with saying nothing, or we can use our voices and we can get brave and practice that skill of asking difficult and awkward conversations. So just before we jump into the chat, the last thing that I wanted just to make you aware of, I'm not going to spend very long on this, is just making you aware of these case study spaces that I am offering. If you are interested in running a mentoring program, you want to know a little bit more, then just book onto a call with me and I'll run through all this. But the idea behind this is that from my perspective, I get some brilliant case studies through. From your perspective, you get a fantastic deal on a mentoring program for your school. If you are interested in booking in a call with me, I will just pop the link into the chat for you. But if you're happy to come off mute, and let's get the conversation started. I'm just going to make sure I've got my link here for a call. Get that dropped into the chat first. Okay, so I'm just reading through these. So developing allies is the most important action needed in EDI. Yeah, ensuring all pupil voices are heard, as it seems large groups have well-established means pupil voice where others don't. Also, getting staff to talk about EDI and not be frightened about it. So true, Emma. I can relate to that. I've spoken to a lot of terrified staff. A focus on belonging and all in the community feelings of belonging. Yeah, absolutely. So, let me. So, who would like to jump on? Maybe we can just dive into one of these first.
So, Miff, I'm very new to your
Mm,
work. This is my first time on this this webinar. Um,
welcome.
so, how is the mentoring program going to work in terms of, this case study? Because I work a lot with teachers on a leadership program, and that's
Mm,
why I'm here. And EDI is my bag, and it's not something that's covered on their leadership program.
mhm.
So yeah, I'm coming at it from that angle, thinking how the conversations get started with children, because children can be some of the most brutal uh, communicators. And my children are mixed race. And over the years, I've had issues at
Mm.
school where, luckily, I feel the bits I've known about anyway have been handled well by the teachers. But what is handling well? I mean, one incident, my son retaliated against a comment, and he didn't get into trouble for it, knowing then that they had that conversation. But the boy had to, was asked to write um, a letter of uh, apology.
Mm.
But I think without discussing it, I wonder how effective that was in terms of educating him about future incidences or those around him as well, rather than, using him as an example and punishing him in some way.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's if and I know it so true to be so true now that I'm a mother as well. Watching, if I tell my daughter that she has to apologize,
Yeah.
the sorry is so unsatisfying. It's that kind of,
No.
you know, dreaded out of them.
Yeah.
And that there's no learning in that. Nothing
Yeah,
changes when that happens. And
exactly.
so the focus for me and what the difference that needs to happen there is how do we create this conversation where we say, well, look, we for start off with a vulnerability piece, and if you're the teacher dealing with that particular individual, you say, look, I I'm not amazing at this. I'm not amazing at this stuff. I'm far from perfect, but I really hope you can open up and talk to me about this. You're looking at taking ownership of your part in this, and how have I, as a teacher, failed in this situation. One of the things I talk about a lot is just taking ownership generally of anything. That when we take ownership, we demonstrate that we've got skin in the game and that we care for our own reasons. And then it's making sure that we are really trying very hard to have empathy with that person that we instinctively want to just tell them that they're wrong. Now, what happens a lot of the time is when if I take this sort of away from EDI and I think about it just as a behavior issue, is a teacher will initiate by saying, "Well, look, I just need to ask this question. What's going on? Why are you behaving in this way?" And what almost always happens is if they get a pupil to start opening up, they will dive straight in with their agenda as to why they shouldn't be doing that thing. Whereas instead of doing that, if we go on to that curiosity piece, so instead of saying, um, well, here's all the reasons you were wrong and hit them with all the boundaries that they should be working within, we go in with curiosity first. It's not to say the boundaries aren't valid, that sort of wraps around the whole thing, doesn't it? But if we
Yeah.
went in with curiosity first and we were saying, you know, what's going on for you? What's happening in your life? What drove that question or that comment that you made? What's driving this behavior that's coming through that isn't serving you or us? What's behind that? What thoughts are going on in your head? And approach it with curiosity rather than judgment. Then we automatically start to build a place where they feel capable of opening up and talking. And that is where, if we demonstrate that empathy first, they will be far more likely to meet it with empathy because they felt connected to. It always, for me, it always goes back to this connection piece. If we can offer that connection first, and we have to do it, it has to be us. We're the grown-ups. So if we can offer that connection first, then they are far more likely to come back with it, to come back and
because,
say,
they're not at that sort of age of 10, 11. Their brains just aren't mature enough to really go there and think in that way. And their main influencers are their parents and their peers.
yeah.
So I think I'm a coach, so my questioning is always around that curiosity. I'm always wondering. So I might just start phrasing the question. I wonder what made you do that, because normally, this is what I see of your behavior, and that just doesn't like fit in with the kind of person I thought you are. I think.
Yeah, it's that curiosity piece. But something that I get asked about a lot is brain development. And again, I'm not an expert. I have an absolute burning passion for reading anything about neuroscience. I love it. It's absolutely my jam. But I'm not an expert. I've just read a lot of books. But what I would say, the theme that comes through with all of them is there's not one day where a switch is flicked and the prefrontal cortex comes online, and all of a sudden we're driving around with conscious thought in it, and we're sort of in the driver's seat. That's not what happens. There needs to be a bit of practice, and then we need to start building it up slowly. And the way that we do that is role modeling it. And the way that we do that is role modeling that empathy piece, because that's what we need to start encouraging them to say, oh, maybe I do have that part of my brain. And that's when, and we could do that from really young. We can start role modeling that. And it becomes easier for them if they've had that role modeling at a younger age. When those parts of the brain do start to come online and the brain starts to kind of choose which bits to keep a hold of, there will be more good stuff to keep a hold of, because they've been role modeling the right stuff in the first place, which is approaching things with tolerance, which is practicing putting yourself in other people's shoes.
Yeah, I think an awful lot of immigrant families, which applies to me, have that desire to retain a culture, being away from the home country. And that means that, there's that fear of integration that is passed on to the children.
Yeah.
And that they carry that into school, I think.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess my curious question there is then, how do you maintain that identity, that really strong identity, and get the best out of a British school? And it's understanding, how does that merge together? And I don't have the answers there. It's for each individual to be questioning that and understanding what that looks like for themselves.
I guess teachers are leaders, and if they become allies and encourage that curiosity within a classroom environment, then it becomes something special and of interest, and knowledge grows and empathy grows then.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. Thank you. That's a really, really interesting take on it there as well. Thank you for sharing your personal experience too. So what else did we have in the questions, talking about Gail, you were mentioning that kind of focus on community feeling and the sense of belonging, knowing your background with boarding. That's I'm not surprised that that's a really important part for you. Do you want to elaborate on that one a little bit?
Yeah, so one of the things that I often hear schools say, and when I was in schools, that was the same, always saying we're a very diverse community. And
Mm,
that's great, except that diverse only means stats and numbers and ticks in boxes. And I always feel that you can be incredibly diverse, and a lot of boarding schools are on the pupil side, not so much on the staff side.
yeah.
But actually, that doesn't mean that belonging is present. It doesn't mean that all those different groups of pupils feel that they are connected with the school. And yeah, in a lot of schools, that I feel that that's the important part, is not so much saying we've got this percentage of pupils from this background or this faith or this disability, but rather how do they feel about the environment that they're in? Do they feel that they have a voice? Do they feel, you use the word agency earlier, do they feel that sense of agency there? And if not, what do we do about it?
Mm,
So yeah, so I think that the diversity bit is really important. The inclusion obviously is really important, but also the belonging. And as you said, in certainly in boarding schools, the fact that you're there 24/7 with them, it's really, or rather, they're there 24/7 with you, and if they don't feel that they belong, that has a real impact on the community.
mm. What do you see working well? Have you got some examples of where you've had schools that are doing a great job? And because I mean, I see it a lot. I know from my experience that they're in boarding schools. There's pockets a lot around nationalities,
Mhm.
and sometimes that is down to the simplicity of language. And I really do get that. I think if you come to an English speaking school and English isn't your first language, then I imagine it's truly exhausting to
Mm.
be, speaking in English all the time. And but then there's that impact that it has on other nationality and other languages in the boarding house. Do you have? I'm sure that amongst your schools you've got some that are doing some great things.
Uh, yes, I mean, obviously there's international pupils, but
Mm,
there's also, a lot of pupils from different backgrounds who are British and still come to boarding for a whole host of reasons. I'm
mhm.
also thinking of pupils on bursaries,
Yes.
those from the Springboard scheme, where there's that disconnect in terms of sometimes socioeconomic background, and how you make sure that how you make sure that they feel included and part of this community that sometimes, by and large, is very privileged. In terms of what's worked well, I think it was Emma who talks about pupil voice. Um, I think that's one of the very, very key things that you can do, but also not shying away from celebrating that diversity, so that in your prospectuses, in anything that is public facing, your website, your policies, etc., it's very clear what the school stands for and the kind of pupils that attend. So yeah, I don't think there's a kind of magic formula. And it's really about culture, which will be different in every school. But that pupil voice bit, and go back to what Manjula wrote as well, that the allyship and the bystanders versus kind of upstanders. If you can teach the pupils in your school to be upstanders and to call out stuff that is not right, then you're bringing that culture where everyone feels that, oh, actually, someone's got my back. And yeah, and that can be really powerful as well. Sorry, that
Yeah.
was a very long answer.
No, no, but I want to pick out a couple of things there that just firstly, the idea of bystanders versus upstanders,
Mm,
and a big part of that is having the language to use, and that's where sharing something like sort of this voice acronym, or um, thinking about what do I need to do to be an upstander, and to do it in a way that will still make me feel safe, because the reason people don't stand up is because they don't want to put themselves on the line and not feel safe. It's a kind of mechanism to keep ourselves safe and feel secure in where we are. And that is very, very heightened, as we all know, for young people. That they feel probably more vulnerable than adults who've got a few more battle scars, perhaps. Um, so thinking about giving them the tools to feel safe to stand up is a really key thing that I think a lot of schools could probably improve on. An example that you've made me think of, and I imagine that Warminster School are probably, I think, are a BSA school. But when I was working there, when I was there as their lead for wellbeing, we had some boys. Some Muslim boys recognizing Ramadan. They were fasting, but it was all kind of kept on the down low at the time. And I spoke to a teacher at Warminster last week, and she was saying it was incredible this year because they had Ramadan, and actually there were some boys that were doing it because they were Muslim, and there was actually a whole host of boys that just joined in, and they just said that they wanted to be part of it and to support it and to sort of have experienced it and learned about it in a really real way. And then they just had an incredible learning experience that would not have happened if they weren't brave enough to say, this is something that we're supporting, we're actively doing. So to go back to your point on kind of publicly sharing and speaking about it and engaging in it, those supporting and enabling that kind of thing, rather than keeping it sort of a little bit hush hush and make sure that these boys are supported and just be aware. That was a really amazing turnaround that I saw there over the past few years. Just a very different mindset to take to it.
Agreed. And I think often it's the things that take not an awful lot of time and certainly actually no funds or anything that make the biggest difference. So that's a really lovely example. Thank you.
Yeah. Emma, you raised the point about staff feeling frightened about talking about EDI, and that's certainly something that I've heard. But what were the points that you were raising?
Yeah, so I think we've had a few sort of inset sessions on EDI related things, and it always brings up this fear around I'm going to get things wrong. And I think that chimes with what you were saying earlier about actually by being curious and sort of admitting you might not know everything, that's a really important place of vulnerability to put yourself into. And maybe people are scared of doing that, of putting themselves in that vulnerable position and not knowing about something. I think as teachers, we like coming from a place of sort of knowing our subject, knowing what we're talking about. And so then in this situation, we don't always know what we're talking about, and actually having that open space to get things wrong is really important. And I think maybe more staff conversations need to happen around that as well. So that's definitely one thing we found, and it's sort of it then becomes more of a battle, because when you then have an inset on something related to EDI, you've already got people that maybe aren't as bought into what's going to happen because they've experienced something that's made them a little bit fearful beforehand. So then they're in this situation where they are actually quite anxious, and that switches them off because they don't want to be put in that scared sort of position. So yeah, that's a bit of a battle at the moment, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we're talking about vulnerability there, what we aren't talking about, how it's being perceived as you describe it, is as a weakness. But when we can frame vulnerability in this sense as bravery, is saying, I might get it wrong. I have asked some horrendous questions in my time, and so if you're not aware of my background, I spent a long time as a Samaritan as well, and that's influenced a lot of what I do nowadays. And some of the calls that I would have, I would feel this fear that I was going to say the wrong thing, and I would really have to summon up bravery and put myself in that position of worrying that I would get it wrong. But the reality was, the only time I ever got it wrong on that call was when I just didn't ask the bleeding question, because then people would feel that I didn't really care, and I wasn't really there for them. I wasn't willing to go there with them, and that it's a slightly different sort of setting. But the point still applies, in that if we are coming from a place of feeling fearful, we are automatically just going to do anything to protect ourselves, which is what you've described there, Emma. I'm shutting off. This is not my bag. I'm not doing EDI. I'm not your person. But what we need to actually shift on. And it's hard. Look, it's hard particularly with independent schools. Historically, they're going to be very full of white British people. That is where we are right now, and it is changing, but that does take time. And it's recognizing, and it's just not letting it be an elephant in the room. It's just calling it out and saying that this is where we are right now, and we're getting better. And the only way we get better is through keeping having these conversations and changing that idea of vulnerability from being a weakness to being bravery. And I think that's a really important mindset shift that I've seen be quite helpful for teachers to say, I'm going to need to be brave here, and I'm going to need to accept that I don't have all the answers. Terrifying for teachers. I do a whole piece around why we don't give advice, and it's hilarious delivering it to teachers, because you spend 90% of your lives being the people with all the answers, and suddenly you don't have them. So I can fully appreciate, I can put myself in those shoes and say, recognize how scary that is. But the bravery, the vulnerability piece is how we get around that, is how we deliver that. Any more questions or points? I've seen the sort of chat going on there in the sideline as well. Just as a reminder that the link is there for if you are interested in looking at the mentoring programs, or you want to kind of bring this conversation offline and into your particular school setting, please, you can pop a call in with me there. There's a little bit of availability today, and then it gets a bit ropey for the next week or so, but I certainly do have some space there for calls. Any other questions? Okay. I wonder, Manjula, would you like to elaborate any more on the SCARF or the core models, and then we'll maybe just wrap up.
Excuse me, you caught me in breakfast.
Oh, sorry.
So SCARF and core are neuropsychology models that speak to those areas of vulnerability that we perceive as threats, and so they're acronyms that are very similar to each other. For example, E stands for equity. If we're not deemed to be equal, that could trigger us. And the brain bit is, it's triggering the amygdala, and do we end up being hijacked and reacting rather than responding with the engaging the prefrontal cortex. And excuse me. So the bit about forum theatre, I don't know if people are aware of how that works, but it's based on the model of the Karpman drama triangles, where you have three key players. You have your victim, your bully, and your bystander. And corporate role play actors may play out a scenario like something that you shared earlier. And you've got three perspectives. You've got the victim's perspective and the bully's perspective, and then you've got the bystander perspective. And in a forum theatre, these corporate role play actors play those parts in a scene, and then the scene is frozen, say at the point where the Jobsworth was asking for the receipt, and then in the group, each actor takes a part of the group. So the group is split into three sections. Say 5 individuals end up with a victim. They would then coach the victim on what to say and do next in the scene. And equally, the bully would have the same resource of 5 individuals. And it offers an opportunity then for perspective to be played out. So the actor will then go back into the scene, and you'll have second scene as directed by the audience. And it provides a safe way to experiment using maybe something like your voice approach. And see what happens if we try this. So yeah, it was used as in a bullying scenario when I was involved, but I explained the Karpman model being I'm a business psychologist as well as a coach, and so we were, you know, it was done in response to a bullying incident within a tight-knit department. So it got the conversation going. Everyone was, you know, had to attend, but they could choose to not be fully, I suppose, you know, participative, but they were doing it at a distance, so they felt safe, psychologically safe, directing their actor to do X, Y, Z and say ABC. So it's a really it's really worth exploring for maybe an inset to get teachers talking about the subject.
Yeah, it's a lovely idea. Lovely. And as you say, safe. You can see why the participants would feel safe in that scenario. Thank you for sharing that. So a useful idea, hopefully, for the others in the room.
You're welcome.
Okay, so are there any other points or ideas or just reflections that anyone wants to share before we finish up for the day?
I love your voice acronym.
Thank you. I was really annoyed with myself because I thought of it yesterday and I'd recorded a podcast talking all about it the day before. So there'll be this podcast that goes out without me actually talking about voice, but talking about all the content of it. I hadn't had it settle in my brain. Clearly, that's one of my weaknesses. I jumped the gun a little bit there. I'll have to re-record. But thank you.
Really well.
Nothing to add, but thank you very much for the session and for the food for thought around the different models, and the voice acronym is really, really helpful.
No, you're really, really welcome. Thank you very much for joining. It's lovely to meet you. Okay, well, guys, we will call it there. Thank you so much for your participation. It's been really lovely to have some new faces in, and have an amazing summer. That's all I will leave it with. Have an amazing summer, switch off, enjoy it. I'm be running some sessions probably from mid-August when people are sort of starting to think about school again. And so if you want to jump in then, I would love to see you there. So all the best, have a great summer, and we'll see you on the other side.
Lovely to meet you. Thank you.
Lovely to meet you, Matthias. Bye.
Thank you. Lovely to see you all. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Gail. Bye.
Bye.
Miff, I just wondered if you could maybe give me an idea of how I can alert my coachees on this coaching program.
Sure, I'm just gonna hit. So yeah, absolutely. I'm just gonna hit pause on the recording.